And welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us late this Friday afternoon. Although I'll note that if it's pretty late on Friday for us, our speaker is in Barcelona where it's much later. I just want to say a couple words about upcoming events at the Center for the Humanities. I'm Hugh Thomas, the director of the center, before I turn it over to Professor Roy, who will do the introduction of our distinguished speaker. So just a couple of notes on upcoming events at the Humanities Center. On Wednesday, February 10th at 8 p.m., our colleague Heather Dyack from the Art and Art History Department will be speaking about her new book, Documents of Doubt, The Photographic Conditions of Conceptual Art. And then the next night, on Thursday, February 11th at 7 rather than 8, we'll have our annual Edith Blythe lecture, and that will feature Kyle Harper, a prominent classicist at the University of Oklahoma, who will be speaking on health and history in a time of pandemic. So another talk on health and history and pandemics in history. And for this afternoon's speaker, I'll turn the introductions over to my colleague, Professor Roy, who can say a few words to let you know about our distinguished speaker. So thanks, Professor Roy.
Okay, thank you very much. It's for me, it's a great honor, to do this brief introductions about the qualifications of the speaker, and it's a double honor, to have this activity with the Center for the Humanities. That, as I mentioned a couple of times, some time ago, I mentioned one of my colleagues that. I didn't know that the author of classic books on the Spanish Civil War and the Cuban Revolution was with us in the history department anyway. And, but then I was told, no, this is not the Hugh Thomas that you were talking about, which was the book on the Spanish Civil War was one of the first, my father bought in Franco, Spain anyway. So for this difficult introduction, I just would like, to basically say that why I'm end up with this honor is simply, for the audience, is that in a previous function of the center, I questioned the link of the 1918 pandemic to Spain, for the pandemic anyway. Looked to me that was one typical, exercise of blaming Spain for any wrong things of the history of the world, and Dr. Antoni Trilla will explain, why this is connected, to Spain. But this the commission, to do this. Also then started, with, in other words, in a way, I was punished for that questioning by giving me a mission, a mission that they looked to me, sort of impossible. Dr. Thomas then asked me, well, find an expert from Spain to explain that to us. To me, that the only knowledge about medicine in Spain, was that eventually I end up, having an apartment not far from the School of Medicine that Dr. Trilla is the dean anyway. So I started asking some colleagues, and I couldn't go very far. Then I did some research of scientific journals, and I find, a very brief but clearly written scientific article on the pandemic of 1918 by a trio of experts led, by Dr. Antoni Trilla. that I just didn't have any idea about his existence anyway. Then if I found out, that actually he was had a double function, the dean of the medical school at the University of Barcelona, and then also a leader, with an institute dedicated to this in the school, but also, as a research scholar. And then is when I realized, this sounds also familiar to me. And then I recalled, hey, this is possibly the same person that I've been following his commentaries in the Catalan television and especially in newspaper columns published in what we can accept that the best paper in Barcelona, and possibly one of the 2 or 3 best in Spain, La Vanguardia of Barcelona, serious newspaper, that you can brand it as a liberal conservative, that, you write there and, people listen to you. And then is when I realized that the person who would give, those commentaries on Catalan TV, was the same, with the author of that paper anyway. And also I would like to stress to you, with my Barcelona background, about the importance of that medical school, the School of Medicine, definitely the best in Spain and possibly one of the best, in Europe, and the hospital attached to it, the hospital clinic. In Barcelona, with the Barcelona people, we can recognize that there are 2 very distinguishable hospitals. One is the Hospital of Sant Pau, which is above the Sagrada Familia. Most of you familiar with pictures of the modernist style, that then a big portion of it, have been refurbished and still functions partially as the hospital. But then there's the other one, the clinic, which, by the way, in the history of many generations, sometimes, people would sort of warn you, or at the same time recommend you to get the treatment at the clinic. For example, if you would do something wrong about driving, going to wrong places, you will be told by your family, don't do that because you are going to end up in the clinic, which, by the way, maybe it was bad, but at the same time was good. Not many years ago, the former king of Spain, okay, let's clarify this, when he was behaving, okay, actually, he was treated several times in the annual checkup at the clinic. So if the king of Spain actually went there for the checkup, that's a good thing. So going back into the role of commentator on TV and on newspaper articles, there is no question about it that Dr. Trilla, for the general public, in a very clear statements, not to show off, about being the doctor and so on, people listen. In other words, this is what you can see that maybe Dr. Trilla would reject the comparison, but in one communication, I mentioned this, in a way or in another, Dr. Trilla could be compared, could be considered as the Dr. Fauci of Spain, with one difference. The difference is that Dr. Fauci had to go 4 years being attacked by the president of the United States. But Dr. Trilla is well connected with all the political parties, and people listen to him with a clear, now, I'll end up, stressing that the personality and the connection with the people, the real people, by saying as Dr. Trilla knows very well, in a couple of weeks, there are going to be a new election in Catalonia, one more. Okay, don't be surprised that some years from now, in the next election or in the election in Spain, then some political party actually invites Dr. Trilla to become part of a government. Now, look, I know very well Dr. Trilla would reject that, but don't be surprised that he would be tempted. And I can tell you that that would contribute, to the victory of that political party. No, I'm not going to reveal for what political party I vote. But Dr. Trilla knows possibly very well. And let's wait. But now let's go back to the central topic of the event anyway. I know very sure that we are going to get, the proper exact explanation first about the connection of the name of the Spanish flu, and then a comparison with what's going on right now. For me, thank you very much. It's an honor. I think I have to shut up now. Thank you.
Well, many thanks, Professor Roy. Many thanks, Professor Thomas and Meg, for your help in setting up this otherwise for me surprising invitation. Living in Barcelona, getting an invitation from such a prestigious university as the University of Miami and the center and things like that. The first time I think someone has made a mistake and sent me an invitation who's not for me. But at the end, with talking through the email with Dr. Roy and Professor Thomas, I think that, well, maybe they want to hear a short history about the Spanish flu in Spain. And before starting the talk, I have to thank very much for the invitation. It's an honor for me to share with you a few topics about the Spanish flu in Spain. I have to admit that I've been already invited, not this time, but other times, and this time also, to join some of the electoral lists and the political parties. But I say each one of us, at least my belief, should do what he believes is doing better. And my first job is to teach at the school and to be a physician, and I'm quite happy with that. So I have no interest in going into politics at all, and even less at these very difficult times in Catalonia, in Spain, and all over the world. So I shared the screen for you, if it went okay. Do you see the screen? Yeah? Good, then. Well, the Spanish flu, it's a name that you all know, 1918 up to 1919. And these are two, one of them is a very well-known picture, the other one is not so well-known. On the left side, you have a self-portrait of Edward Munch, that is supposed to be one of the painters who paint most self-portraits, I think has a record of self-portraiting himself. And this one is after recovering from the 1918 flu. So Edward Munch suffers the flu, and then when he recovers, although in the picture I don't believe it's very well recovered at the time being, he survives the Spanish flu. The other one is a Kandinsky picture that it's made to make an example of the variability, the types of virus that affect us, pretty much the same virus, with when there is a major change, like it happens in 1918, then if some conditions are met, you could face a pandemic of flu that in fact, until this COVID-19 disease is the most recognized threat as being the cause of a pandemic, the flu virus. The flu virus is in time and at the end connected with the World War II, World War I, sorry, in 1914, 1918, a very cruel war, especially in the number of victims. These are the battlefields in France. And if we take through statistics, the First World War lasted 4 years, 3 months and 14 days, and suppose that more than 37 million people, military people, army people die, and close to 10 million civil casualties should be added. So with close to 50 million people death in 4 years, and 3 months. Late in the war, when the USA is putting all his military power in trying to help the Europeans in the war, there are a lot of training camps, and some of them are very big ones with a lot of young people from your country coming from every part of the country put together to be trained very quickly and to be deployed to the European battlefields. And it happens, at least it was one of the first notices, that in one of these camps, Camp Funston in Kansas, in March of 1918, there is some records that say young people develop very high fever and feel extremely tired within hours. They were not able to walk. It's a strange kind of disease with a high fever, and then they were not able to work. And the worst thing is that some of them, in fact, many of them, develop a very severe pulmonary failure, so they cannot breathe. They have a cardiac failure associated to the lung failure, and they die. Either they die very soon, or they die a week or 10 days later on because of a bacterial pneumonia. That is a complication. We know that very well at the time being. First, it came the flu, then in the old times and also these days, they came some bacteria, especially pneumococci, that could lead you to another complication and lead also to death. This new strain of flu that is well recognized that it was a clinical picture resembling the flu. The flu virus was not identified until 1933. So at the time being, they know the clinical picture, but they didn't know what is the exact virus that causes the flu. And it start spreading quite fast at the time being. In this time, the travels around the world was not so easy and so fast that they are now, but with the war and the movement of troops and things like that, there is a lot of people moving back and forth from the USA to Europe. That's the first way, and then thereafter it spreads all over the world. So it seems there is not a clear theory of what is the real origin of the flu virus, but one of the most accepted is perhaps it starts really, or it shows first in the USA in March, and then moves by the American troops to France in April, May. Other authors said that maybe it starts in France and go the other way. That could be a possibility. Some of them even said that probably it starts in China, go to the west coast of the States because of the interchanging people living from China here, and then it moves. But at the well, we don't know exactly. Probably we will never know exactly where it starts. But certainly, I think we all agree it not starts in Spain. The big picture is that there will be close to 50, up to 70, and some other people say maybe 100 million deaths in just a little bit more than 10, 12 months. So the flu virus is a more efficient killer than 4 years of a war. And that's a very interesting thing to know, because biological threats are responsible sometimes of one of the major disasters in wars and other things that happens to human beings. So we face the most devastating, the worst scenario of pandemics, that's the flu pandemic of 1918. There are some of the US newspapers with a lot of headlines, death, schools closed, funeral ban, and things like that. So there is a lot of things happens at the time being, but it's also worth to notice that it seems, and some of the best writers that are US authors of the Spanish flu said, this is a kind of forgotten epidemic. So at the time being, people really suffers from the flu, but 100 years later, it seems that nothing is well written. There are not very many records. There are a lot of good books about the flu and things like that, and a lot of progress on the medical side, the biological side of the pandemic, but certainly because of maybe because the world is upside down with the war, the ending of the war and things like that, it went a little bit unnoticed thereafter. And this is a thing that we have to deal with. One of the worst thing of this flu epidemic in 1918, it changes the regular curve of mortality. When the flu hits the human beings. Usually more death is concentrated in the earlier years of life, very young people, newborns, and things like that, and in the older ages, over 60, 50, and especially over 80. This is what we call the U-shaped death curve, a little bit more in the beginning, nothing in the middle, and then rising again at the later stages of life. But in the year 1918, the flu shows a very clear different pattern. It's what we call the double W-shaped curve. Still very young people die, but in the Middle Ages, people from 20 to 30 to 40 ages has also a high death rate. And then also at the later stage ages of life. So this is a unique death mortality pattern for the 1918 flu. And that is one of the things that should be remembered. Young, healthy people could die in a very fast clinical course because of the flu. What happens in Spain? Well, you are historians. I only will make a few comments to, let's say, make a brief statement. Spain was ruled at the time being by Alfonso XIII. That is the same dynasty that we have at the King Philip now in Spain. Certainly, Spain, compared to other countries, was at the time being a poor and maybe updated country. It doesn't progress as much as other European countries. Very important thing for understanding the name of the pandemic, we in Spain remain neutral in the First World War, so we didn't side with any of both sides. But in Spain, the situation is not a calm one. We have revolutionary strikes, especially very powerful workers' union strikes, trying to get rights for the workers and things like that. And we start what we can say within, let's say, brackets, the Catalan problem. So the Catalan people make a strong political statement to be more autonomous, or even, I don't know, at the time being independent is the right word, but they go to the Spanish parliament and make clear demands on that, and the state handle it probably not very well at the time being. And we start also facing some conflicts in the north part of Africa with older colonies from Spain, like Morocco. So the situation is a very unstable one in Spain. This is a couple of pictures of our hometown from Professor Rayamid. This is Barcelona, the old part of the town at the time being. So pictures that can show how people lived at the time being. And this is a one that I have to show. This is one of the first stadium, well, not a stadium, in fact, it's a soccer field for the Football Club Barcelona, one of the best, at least up to now, football clubs in the world. And in the background of the picture, there is the hospital clinic and the School of Medicine. So we are very close together historically. Now the Football Club Barcelona has moved a little bit far away, but we are pretty much at the same time. So the hospital clinic and the School of Medicine was built in 1907. So at the time of the flu, we are in full operation at the time being, and very close to where the Barcelona plays the Spanish and the Catalan league at the time being. And this is, we believe, all starts with the Spanish flu name. On May 22nd is the big week in Madrid. It's the San Isidro holidays and very popular ones. And it seems that the Spanish press start recording that some people had a very strange disease, a mild one at the time being. People had high fever, feel very tired. Not very many people die at this time, but it went to the press, it makes some headlines, and people after a few weeks start talking about an epidemic. And this is a cartoon that say that all the scientists, the physicians, and the public health officers at the time being is trying to look to the cause, to the bacteria or the virus that is causing the disease. They didn't find out anything and did not do a very good job at the time being, and people start not having very much faith in the health system or in the medical system, because the first news in a world that is under some censorship on the press due to the war happened, or it arises in Spain. The British and later on all the world name this flu as the Spanish flu. So in Spain, we say la gripe española. It has nothing to do as the origin with Spain, but is a name who has remained throughout the history, and I think it will not be changed. So we have to remember this, the worst epidemic in history about flu. It's called the Spanish flu. It seems that the first notices went from a Spanish wire news service that's called Agencia Fabra, that sent a cable to the news services in London, and then it spreads all over the world with this very brief and clear description. A strange form of disease of epidemic character has appeared in Madrid. The epidemic is of a mild nature, no death having been reported so far at the end of May 1918. Few days later on, the Spanish newspaper, this is one from Madrid, El Sol, the Sun, he had said the 3 days fever. So the name, the disease like 3 days fever, of course, here in Spain has not been known as the Spanish flu. And they said in Madrid, there should be, or maybe there are short of 80,000 people with the disease. And Her Majesty the King is ill with this flu, and he recovers. The Prime Minister also gets ill, but at this time being, it seems like it's certainly a milder disease. Thereafter, it seems that there is a sort of pattern of diffusion back and forth of people with the flu that have been contained, have the disease at the time being. And this has very much to do with the interchange of Spanish workers that went to the south part and the central part of France, because in France there is a war and there is someone who have to harvest things and do things and things like that. They move by train, they enter through the French border, either going to the south part of Spain or going to Portugal and also to the south part of Spain. So massive transportation of Spanish and Portuguese workers from to France. And if we believe that the virus is already circulating in the battlefields of France with the US soldiers going back and forth from the States and things like that, probably we get the flu from this interchange of people in the middle of Europe and then go back to home. And then because of the press and things like that, it happens that we have a new problem when there is the same problem all over the Europe and very soon all over the world. 3 waves over 10 months. The first one in spring 1918, a very mild one. The second wave, the worst one, the highly lethal one in the fall of 1918. And then a small, also in the middle or half between the first and the second wave in terms of severity of illness in the winter of 1918. And that's all. So the Spanish flu disappears. As it appears, it disappears 10, 11 months thereafter, but the flu remained with us, not causing more pandemics, but being one of the other flu viruses that every year changes and stays, sometimes disappears, sometimes they come back again. And we still have now, let's say, a well-connected virus, H1N1, as I show you at the end, connected with this original 1918 flu virus. This is another picture. Now we will face a little bit very quickly about Barcelona situation at the time being. This is a very well-known cafeteria and bar. It's called the Zurich one, still not in the same place, but still open in Barcelona. And then you have one of the first questions, how people in 1918 could deal with a new disease or a new pandemic without many things to do. And there is no treatment for the Spanish flu at the time being, not an effective treatment at least. The best recommendation that physicians could give to the people is you take rest as much as possible, you get a healthy diet, and at the time being in a poor Spain, that means chicken soup, and not everyone could afford to have chicken soup nor rest. So, and personal hygiene, open the windows, wash your hands, things that we heard from the COVID-19 last year were very common, also the same kind of advice in 1918. In Barcelona, this is La Vanguardia, the newspaper that Professor Roy refers. It's an old newspaper, so in fact, I think it's more than 120 or 150 years old, something like that. At the end, it happens that every single day during the pandemic, there is a full column that's called the epidemic, or the epidemic that affect us. And there is some updating of the statistics and the news and things like that. The epidemic was officially declared in Barcelona in the second wave in October 1918. That is the deathly one. So they feel at the time being they are facing a very difficult problem to handle. There is a very limited role of public health officers. There is not a public health system strong enough to handle this kind of a situation. The system was clearly overwhelmed by the epidemics. And even in our medical school, last year, medical students were, let's say, asked if they want to work and help as physicians until the epidemic was over. So were recruited as voluntary physicians at the end of his 6-year medical training. Some statistic could give you an overview what happens in Spain and in Barcelona in October 1918. These are some statistics from the graveyards. And in October 1918, on the 19th of October, there were 315 deaths in Barcelona. And the next day, on the 20th of October 1918, 322. The same year, the same dates 1 year before, October 1917, there were only 43 and 33 deaths. So the number of deaths is multiplied by a factor of 10 during the worst part of the pandemic. And at the time being, in the Spanish newspapers, in the front pages, there were what we call in Spanish esquelas. It's not an obituary, it's a short version of obituary with the name, the age, and very few words about each one that it dies, sorry. Usually there will be just 1 or 2 pages, and it were in the front pages because people walking by the street could see in the front pages who has been dead or who dies the day before. In the worst of the pandemic, there will be more than 7 pages of this kind of obituaries in the Spanish newspaper, at least in La Vanguardia, and not everyone could afford to pay for this kind of notice or this kind of obituaries in La Vanguardia. And there is also some anecdotal things. The power of the church in Spain, a very Catholic country at the time being, it's a very strong power, and as always happens when we face a new plague, it seems that we did something wrong, and God gives us some punishment and for our sins and things like that. So the church starts saying we have to pray all together and ask God for forgive us and for we have not behaved quite well. In Zamora, a very small country in Spain, that is a very powerful bishop and let's say quite a sizable cathedral. There were, I would not dare orders, but certainly a strong suggestion that people should go to the cathedral to pray and ask for forgiveness every day. So they meet all together, all or some of them with the flu, in a very close space. They move like mass gathering, and Zamora has one of the highest death rate in Spain through over the epidemic, and is let's say a kind of cruel irony that the Virgin that is devoted the cathedral to, it's called the Transit Virgin. So it's a transit from this world to the new world because everyone dies because of the epidemic at the time being. Then we have not very many data. What is the real impact of the flu epidemic in Spain, taking into account the number of cases and the number of deaths? At the time being, 1918 and 1919, the Spanish population is a little below over 20, maybe close to 21 million inhabitants. Now they are close to 47. And the official statistics of mortality, taking into account the death certificates of the time being, is close to 170,000 people. We use the same statistics like the CDC uses in the United States to add up all the people that dies in a combined index that's called pneumonia and influenza index. So people could be added together. This gives you an overall estimation of the real death, or the much closer to real death rate of the flu. And making those calculations in Spain from official statistics, we end up maybe closer to 300,000 people die. And this is an estimated infection fatality ratio, so how many people with the flu dies, of between 3 and 5%, and it means probably close to 1.5% of all the Spanish population at the time. In the right side, you have a graph that is probably well known with COVID disease. That's what we call excess mortality. So the white bars means the historical mortality over the same period, the last 3 years, the 3 years before, and then you plot there the actual mortality during an epidemic. And the red bars means people who dies in excess compared to the historical baseline, right? There are a lot of people, especially in October, November, a little bit less in December. So there are very, very tough months in order of the number of people who is dead, a number of people who suffers also from very severe complication of the disease. So the numbers are never exact because the world has very different ways of taking into account the statistic. Maybe at the time being in 1918, there is no statistics in most parts of Africa, very few statistics in China and things like that. But some people devoted to public health said that probably the figure is closer to this one. The more accepted one is 50 million people die in the Spanish flu, compared to the more contemporary ones like 1957 Asian flu, 1.1 million people. The 1968 Hong Kong flu, another pandemic, is the three pandemics of the 20th century, 1 million people. And the last one that probably you remember, the 20 A flu, Mexican flu, whatever the name you want to give it, is very, very much less people die. So certainly 1918 Spanish flu is the deadliest epidemic in history, in the modern history, but still is considered the worst case scenario whenever you plan for anything related to a pandemic. Just a few words about the very interesting history that it has all happened in the States. A pathologist working in the university, I think at the beginning, the University of Iowa, start thinking about where he could find samples of people who had died from the Spanish flu. And after doing some investigation, he find out that probably in some place that the earth is literally frozen much of the time, there will be some people buried in there that could be well preserved, and maybe he had some chance of retrieving the virus. The name of the researcher was John Halting, and Halting ended up discovering that in Breivik Mission in Alaska, there is some records that say that 85% of the population, a small population, died in 1918. So they, I think, fairly believe that most of them should die from the flu. So there is a native population with no contact with the virus. A new virus goes there, the death rate is very, very high. And they end up finding 3 corpses, and one of them from an Inuit woman buried in permafrost. So it's a natural frozen. And it has kept like this 100 years or something like that. And they take samples from these. They ask for permission from the community, the religious leaders, and so far they give the permission. So they take some samples from the lung of this woman who died of the flu in 1918, and together with the American Force Institute of Pathology, where there is the other big name, John Halting for going to Alaska, Jeffrey Taubenberger, who works for the American Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, retrieve also some samples from soldiers who died in 1918 because of the flu, but some of these samples were embedded in paraffin, and this difficult a little bit to retrieve some viral components. So they end up taking the samples from this Inuit woman who died in Alaska, and after hard work in the lab, they were able to retrieve RNA from the lung tissue, and they were able to identify that this belongs to a flu virus type A H1N1, the same like the 2009 last pandemic, not exactly the same, but the same name and number. And probably because of very complex phylogenetic analysis going back in time, they believe that probably the virus in 1918 jumped from the avian population to the human population. That happens quite often with the flu viruses. More interesting, that have been headlines in the best medical journals and science journals like Nature, Science, and so forth. Jeffrey Taubenberger and colleagues were able to resurrect the virus. So they end up making a virus exactly as the same virus that were retrieved from the woman, and then they make some sort of experiments like this one, trying to inject some mice in a mouse in the lab and see what happens with a contemporary H1N1 virus and the old, or the 1918 H1N1 virus. And to make a long history short, the 1918 virus, at the 24 hours after the mouse has been injected, it's 50 times higher, more, you have 50 times more higher virus loads freed in the lung cells. A couple of days later on, you have 40,000 more virus detected at the lungs. So there's exponential growth of a very aggressive virus, and the death rate in mice was 100%. So they were handling a very, let's say, difficult to retrieve, difficult to understand virus that is fortunately never appeared again since 1918. It seems now that this has to do with a new virus that, instead of activating our normal innate immune response, we make antibodies, we try to keep rid of the virus, we try to, let's say, control the aggression of a virus, and we do in a very difficult and balanced situation, but sometimes we go into a sort of imbalance, and it happens the same with COVID-19. You heard that people have a very severe lung disease. It's not exactly due to the virus, but to what we call a cytokine storm, or very immunological storm, thing like that. It happens pretty much the same, not exactly the same, but pretty much the same with the 1918 pandemic strain, because he activates an overactive immune response, and that makes a lot of severe harms to our body, lungs, liver, kidney, brain, everything. So the clinical symptoms were very severe, and the most important thing is that usually in a normal flu season we have a 0.1% fatality rate. So 1 in 1,000 people with the flu has a chance of dying. In the 1918 virus, that was very high. It's close to 2.5%. Remember, COVID-19 at the time being is a little bit less than 1%. So still, flu virus of 1918 pandemic flu is a very death virus, and with a very severe spectrum of clinical symptoms. Just for finishing, a couple of technical things, because probably over this year we all become a little bit of amateur epidemiologists, and having talked about reproductive numbers and contagions and things like that. This reproductive number for the 1918 flu virus between 2 and 3, it's very much higher than for a normal flu virus, and it's a little bit closer to COVID-19 virus at the time being. The fatality ratio, infection fatality ratio, as I mentioned, is 2.5, very much higher than a regular flu virus. And there is another couple of things that could explain such a high death rate in all over the world in the flu of 1918, that there were a lot of infectious complications, notably bacterial pneumonia were a very common cause of death. And at the time being, there was no antibiotic treatment. So people has no chance of surviving. There is no, of course, ICUs to support people from respiratory failure, and there is no an effective vaccine. So we are left with bare hands to handle this kind of a very severe epidemic. We don't have yet a universal flu vaccine. So if we face now another pandemic, we have to search and do a lot of research trying to find out the best vaccine that we can. So 100 years later on, we still do not have what we call a universal. We are probably much closer, but we still do not have what we call a universal flu vaccine, a vaccine that could handle quite well different strains of changing flu viruses. And I will just try to finish with a very interesting article published, as you see, in the journal Science on May 13, 1919. This was written by Major George Soper, who is a military physician, who writes a very interesting article at the time being. Remember, we are reading a journal from 100 years ago, after the Spanish flu has ended. And the title was The Lessons of the Pandemic. It says, the pandemic which has just swept around the earth has been without precedent. There have been more deadly epidemics, but there have been more circumscribed. There have been epidemics as widespread, but they have been less deadly. Floods, famines, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions have all written their stories in terms of human destructions almost too terrible for comprehension. Yet never before has there been a catastrophe as one so sudden, so devastating, and so universal that the Spanish flu. If you were able to retrieve this article and read now, most, if not all of the phrases, everything that Dr. Soper say in this article could apply also to the COVID-19 epidemic that we are suffering in all the world again at the time being. And many thanks for your attention. This is the CDC, the Center for Disease Control logo or motto for last year. That was the centennial of the flu pandemic. And they say, we remember, we prepare. And I think that we don't remember that well. And unfortunately, we are not so well prepared as we are feeling like now with the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much for your attention. My best wishes that you all keep safe and your family also is keeping healthy and well. And hopefully, I don't know when, but a few months or maybe not very many months, I think the situation will improve. And hopefully we will be back slowly but steady to our normal life. That certainly it's one thing that we all want very, very, very strongly.
Well, thanks so much for that very informative talk. And the audience may have guessed this by now, but I'll, in case they haven't, I'll just add that the fact that you're on the front lines and dealing with this, this current wave makes us all more thankful that you've taken time out of your busy schedule to give us this talk.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was elected as a dean before the pandemic. And being an epidemiologist, thereafter, I say someone is thinking very well in advance. So they put a dean in the school that have some knowledge of epidemiology. So they make, say, that could not happen to me, everything at the same time. But well, it's the way it is.
Well, in terms of questions, I'll just say to the audience that we'll ask you to write your questions in the Q&A button, and I'll pick them out and read them. But I'll start as people do that with a question from Meg. And that has to do with what you, maybe builds on what you ended with. In the general public, I don't think many people were aware of the 1918-1919 epidemic. And I mean, I knew it a little bit as a historian, even though my period is much earlier. But how aware of this or epidemiologists and other medical professionals, and how is historical knowledge of that, and perhaps of these more recent ones that you also mentioned, how does that shape the medical profession? Does it shape it as much as it should, or has this current one really been a wake-up call?
Well, this is a very interesting question because how my colleagues at the time being behave, it's also a reflection on how we behave as human beings. Some of them are heroes, some of them are, you could pick up some of them that this should be and will be a hero. Some that you believe it's considered to be a hero just run away, and it happens. And some very unknown physicians stay at the post until the last moment, not leaving people without at least any help, the help that we can do. And I think that we didn't learn very much from this epidemic until recently, because when it comes up to the 100-year celebrations and things like that, many people start writing papers and doing things like that. And I think that if we pay very much attention what happens then, I think that we will probably be a little bit more open-minded what could happen to us. This is a kind of the worst scenario, the 1918 flu, that we say, well, it'll never happen again. It could not happen again. So it has been so terrible, so devastating, in a very different situation and things like that. That's true, but we face different threats like the one that we have now. And probably we've been a little bit, let's say, naive of thinking that such a bad thing could never happen to our well-developed health system, to our technology, to our powerful medicine, to the ICUs, to whatever weapons we have. And look, another small virus, and the world is upside down at the time being. Although there's certainly making a vaccine in a 10-month period, it's a miracle, or it's one thing that if you now everyone is asking for the vaccine. At the beginning of the pandemic, we said if we are lucky, maybe in a couple of years or 3 years, we can start having some vaccines. So things have changed very much, and people although there is a high death rate, is clearly surviving. We don't have many treatments, but things are improving at the time being. And I don't know, but being, let's say, is one of my favorite pandemic is 1918 pandemic. It's a sort of historical thing that we don't know, or we don't believe it could happen really to us, and it happens.
Thanks. Thanks. And now I'll turn to questions from the general audience. One I can actually answer because it's a technical one about whether the recording of this will be available, and the answer is yes. We will be posting it in the next couple of days, or maybe early next week, since it's Friday, on the Humanities Center website. Next question I want to turn to is, were there any lessons learned from the Spanish flu outbreak or the 1918-19 outbreak that could be applied now during COVID-19?
Also very interesting questions. I think that if we look backwards, there is some lessons that we should have learned. I don't clearly could say that we have learned those lessons, but I think we should have learned some lessons. If you read the full article of Dr. Soper, it gives some advice at the end. And in another lecture at the University of Barcelona, I didn't explain to the audience that I am using a text from 1919, and I explained like it was advice for this current epidemic. And people said, well, this makes a lot of sense. Yeah, but this is said 100 years ago. And we are saying the same things. Open the windows, wash your hands, cover your mouth, eat well. And they said 100 years ago, the same advice that we are giving here. So we have not been making very much progress of terms of public health measure that could at least control a little bit better a difficult to control virus that is spread from person to person by the air or by breathing and talking. It's a very, very difficult situation. So I think we don't learn so many lessons from the 1918 flu, but well, it's a personal opinion. I don't know if many people has a different opinion, but for me,
all right, thanks. Next question is this. Given that scientific medicine had so few tools then to fight the disease, did any Spanish doctors or citizens use alternative therapies to any effect on the 1918 pandemic? And I may add on myself, a positive effect or maybe negative effect.
Yeah, well, I think they turn to everything that they have, but they don't have many things at the moment. So natural things, they make goggles with garlic and things like that. I think they pray a lot. That's a thing that you never know if it helps very much or not, but they go to the church, try to pray and things like that. But many people use different things that were on the market that have no effect on the flu virus. Probably the only thing that were used that could help a little bit is that at the time being we have salicylic acid, that aspirin in common words, and they have some, let's say, improvement, certainly with the fever and things like that, but not very many things. They take, for example, they are selling some pills of quinine that doesn't help a lot. It's like, maybe it's a little bit the story of hydroxychloroquine in COVID-19 and quinine in 1919. Natural remedies probably did not harm because they use boiled things and things like that. But I'm not aware that they were, let's say, at the time being fake news or ultraviolet lights or bleach that you swallow in order to improve the flu at the time being.
Thanks. I'll note that there are both questions about the historic pandemic and about the present one. And I think I'll take questions about the historic one as a group first, and then turn to more recent questions. Were there any signs of variant strains of the flu virus identified from the 1918 Spanish flu? Could this have played a role in its high mortality rates?
It seems that the virus has kept very much the same through the 8, 9, 10 months of the pandemic. So no changes between the first, the second, and the third wave, at least as far as we know. But there is very few virus retrieved from the different, let's say, waves. So we have to make a guess that probably the virus, it's quite stable. The real thing is that the virus itself is a new one, a completely new one. It has reshaped some of the genes from different origins, and that the only thing that happens is most of the population do not have immunological memory or any defense against a new virus. And that explains a little bit the high incidence in the people who, it's a paradoxal thing. Young people could defend themselves, has a stronger immunological system, and could, let's say, it's like a brakes in the car. They have a very strong brakes, and when they get hit by the virus, they put the brake as much as possible, and then they crash. And the older people could not mount such a strong defense, and they handle a little bit better with the virus. This is for the flu related mortality. Thereafter it comes the bacterial complications that without antibiotics, you can do anything except survive or die. So it's a matter of chance.
Thanks. How did the general public reach an understanding that the 1918-19 epidemic was over? What information did they have, and how did that compare with our current state of information?
As far as I know, in the Spanish press, there is a lot of data during the epidemic, and someday it just disappears, and that's all. And the strange thing is probably that thereafter, not many people talk about the flu in the coming years, and probably there are other kind of well, not very closely, but the world is not in a very, let's say, stable condition at the time being. So people forget about the Spanish flu. And in the rest of the world, I think that when the war, the First World War is over, and certainly in the States, there is a lot of local news and things like that. But I think also thereafter, no one pays very much attention. Probably the most well known is like the equivalent of the Spanish Civil War, right? By you for the Spanish flu is a John Barry book that's got the great influenza. It is the first time that many people say, wow, there has been a flu 100 years in my country, and I didn't know quite well what happens. No, it's sort of a strange thing, this kind of silence, for not an absolute silence, but a lot of silence until recently.
Okay. The next question had to do with the impact of that pandemic on South America.
Mm-hmm. Not very many data, some data from Argentina, data from Brazil, local outbreaks well characterized. I think that, especially from the southern part of South America, there are enough data to say that they suffer the flu very much like the other parts of the world. I don't know if it's Central America, probably there is some data also from Mexico and things like that. My feeling is that although there is not a lot of information or official statistics, there are some researchers that have published local outbreaks in cities or in some parts like that, and the picture looks very much the same. So I think South America suffered at least my guess is that they suffered the same kind of pandemic that we in Europe and you in the States. For Africa, news and data are very small, and also from most of Asia, although we know that there have been the same pandemic in Japan, in the Philippines, maybe in some parts of China, and probably all over Asia, but we don't have any records to prove that.
And then, how did the pandemic end? Was it something that happened to the virus? Was it herd immunity?
I think, or we think, that probably is because of herd immunity. Enough people get infected in order to make some sort of immune response. Older people probably have some memory back of some antibodies to the flu virus, although it's a new one, and maybe they have some sort of protection. And probably after a while it went away, although it kept with us. So it's still with us for maybe 10, 15 years thereafter, and until a new strain replaces it, and then it just evolves. And the last, I think, 15, 20 years, we have an H1N1 virus with us that is a long cousin or long niece of the original 1918 virus.
Okay. Now, I think we're going to go a little past 5, even though I realize I'm dangerously impinging on people's happy hour. And also, I realize it's rather late in Barcelona. There's still questions scrolling in about the earlier pandemic. I don't think we'll get to all the questions, but I think out of fairness, I'm going to go back to some of the earlier questions about the current situation. And so one is just a general question about the situation in Spain right now, and related to that, there's in the US, there's this group of anti-maskers. Is there a parallel group in Spain?
Spanish has been one of the first hit countries by the COVID-19 earlier in February, March of this year, and we, together with the north part of Italy, are one of the hardest hits in the first wave. So we have a very rough time during March, April, and May. Then we have a little break, not very much, during the summer. And in September, they started what we probably, well, not certainly the second wave that is very much well characterized. We have better diagnostic tests. The hospital's a little bit prepared, but was also a strong one. And thereafter, a little bit of reduction of the number of cases, and rapidly again, the third wave or the second and a half wave, you can talk each one, that we are facing now. And now we are in a very, very high figure situation. A lot of deaths, a lot of new cases, hospitals are full. Again, ICUs are struggling to admit new people. Dangerous situation, at the same time starting vaccination campaign that will be of great help, but not now, probably in the next couple of months, and a very difficult situation. Spanish citizens had behaved mostly quite well, severe lockdowns during the first wave, stay at home, literally, so you cannot only just go to your work if you are considered an essential worker. If not, everyone should stay at home. We have been in this situation for 3-4 weeks. The economy crashed down, and I don't know when we'll recover. But certainly we, and in most of Europe, these kind of strict lockdowns for a long period of time had helped to reduce the death rate, because they reduced the number of contacts and the number of cases, and then the hospitals could handle a little bit more and better of people who is with severe disease. And certainly, I think that the same in all over the world, the older population with a terrible death rates. People over 80 has a chance, or is responsible for more than 15-20% of all deaths. And young people usually, fortunately, very mild disease. And again, even more fortunately, children, very no disease or no deaths in the child people. But here are now a good, let's say, a heavy preoccupation about what will happen over the next month, because of the British variant of the virus, that it's easily or much easily transmissible. So we don't know, but and just also a personal comment. Hopefully the situation in the state will improve, because such a big country with a very good public health system, reference for all of us, like is the CDC, being handled in such a different ways, and the death rates and the number of cases that you are suffering also in the States are, I think no one deserves that, but the States is very strong in terms of health system, should, I think, have done better. Hopefully you will do better, hopefully from the soonest the better at the time being.
Yes, definitely fingers crossed on that one. What are your thoughts on the role of climate change and subsequent natural ecosystem disturbance leading to future pandemics?
Certainly the climate has to some disease, infectious disease has a strong influence. The temperature, the other factors could change the ecology of some of the hosts or some of the viruses that, or bacteria that could affect us. We don't have a clear picture of what could happen, but certainly I think that the climate change is a threat for our health itself in terms of other disease, and certainly it will not help in the terms of control of any new infectious disease, especially some of them that could be transmitted. For example, I don't know, West Nile fever or something like that. If the temperature changes, the mosquito living ranges could change, and we can face an extension of things. For example, I think like in the States, we get rid of malaria in the 1950s or something like that. Very small places in Spain at the time being still have malaria. Malaria could be again among us if there is a major change on the temperature range for the Anopheles mosquito. So I think we have to do as much as we can to control or stop the climate change and the effect that we as humans has on this change, because for our health is a bad thing to go in this direction either way.
So in spite of knowing about 1918 flu, could you comment why we have failed? Is it just our naiveness or is it complacency? So flu just knew that there would soon be a respiratory virus pandemic.
So you mean, as far as I understand, you mean why we have failed now?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the question is asking is, why didn't we learn more from the?
I don't know. And certainly, to put things in a context, it's very difficult to stop a virus that is transmitted from personal contact through the air very easily. Like the COVID-19 virus is not in our way of life to keep at home with everything closed, not having contact one from each other. It could not happen so it's difficult to stop. This is one thing. The other thing, thinking as we face the first wave of the epidemic, at least from my personal opinion, and I think I suffer myself from this, is a kind of, let's say, this could not happen to us. So this should be a minor thing, an outbreak in China. Maybe we get some imported cases. We have a strong system. We can control that. We have done that better or not with Ebola in West Africa, very few cases imported. There are different things, but we say, well, maybe this should be another flu virus or something like that. It's not a flu virus. It behaves in a different way. And I think we don't have the tools to stop from the beginning, and we have to learn how to copy with them, and hopefully how to sidetrack and give this virus a chance to be another infectious disease, not this kind of pandemic. So like the virus, other viruses will produce some cases that are severe enough, and some people will die from COVID-19, but not the present situation. So we have to go as the faster we can to have an immune status so widespread that it could help to stop the transmission, the efficient transmission of the virus.
Okay, thanks. And now I'll go back to, there's three last questions, and then I'll call it a halt, going back to the earlier one. And so we'll do that and then give you a well-deserved rest. So the first of these has to do with travel then. And did people try to self-isolate at all? Were there any travel restrictions? I guess sort of, again, parallels to the current one.
Yep. Yeah. There is certainly some travel restrictions. Some borders were supposed to be closed from time to time. It doesn't help. You cannot have a border close to a virus, but well, and in Spain, there is some restrictions, for example, in people who travel by train, and those workers who came from France, and sometimes we were not able to go back or descend from the train, take out from the train until they reached the final destination. So we kept hours and hours in a train, and probably they have even more contact and more people get infected. And when they get home, whoop, spread. In the military camps in Spain, when they have the flu, they decided to send all the privates to home. So they widespread again everything among them. So no travel restrictions, as we understand the travel restrictions that are now, but certainly people believe that trying to restrict some movements or not letting people move very much will help, but I don't believe it helped very much. As far as I remember, I had some statistics that at the time being, it takes more than 3 weeks to go around the globe if you use different kind of transportation. If you compare that with the 24, 36 hours that it takes now, the situation is quite a different one. Although the virus spread or has been there and then explodes very rapidly in 1918.
Thanks. Was there a significant morbidity and mortality in the younger children in the Spanish flu 1918 in that sort of W shape?
Yeah, not very much in the very young ones. The under 5 years old, there has some mortality, but not very different from a regular flu. The high mortality rate was concentrated in the segments of 20 to 40 years of age, mostly, and that was very unusual.
Okay, and then the last question, did the time frame of the flu in Spain parallel with the time of the waves of the flu elsewhere, for example, in the US or France?
Flu is a very interesting disease because it moves at different speed. It's like a little bit like COVID-19. So you have in some states a situation, in other states it seems to be a week before or a week later than expected. So more or less the pattern is spring wave, mild one in different parts of the world. Certainly is a clear worst wave in October, November, and December 19. And then the third one, it may take a little bit much longer in other parts of the world, but it's milder in between. So I think that the regular pattern is pretty much the same. The exact data, maybe the 15 days or a month later in one places or earlier in others, but more or less it's pretty much the same.
Well, thanks. And there's still more interesting questions, and I'll apologize to the questioners. We've abused your time more than enough.
It's a pleasure.
Is there. And so I'm like to thank you once again for giving this wonderful and very informative talk. And I'd like to thank our audience for coming out on a Friday afternoon, and hope you'll join us again. So once again, thanks to everyone.